Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
My stomach dropped so hard I thought I was going to throw up. I was standing in line at Costco, loading rotisserie chickens and giant tubs of hummus onto the conveyor belt when I saw the picture. It was a grainy photo my cousin Beth had just posted. Megan and her new husband Jeremy standing on the front steps of the house I grew up in. The caption read, "First week in the newlyweds' forever home. Can't believe Aunt Sharon and Uncle Ron gave them the house as a wedding gift. Hashtag blessed hat family goals." I stood there frozen, holding a box of plastic utensils, not even hearing the cashier greet me. The house, my parents' house, the one I had paid off in full 5 years earlier, after my dad got laid off and the bank started sending foreclosure notices. The house they were going to lose, until I quietly wrote a check and told them it was a financial fluke, a forgotten inheritance from Grandma Lou's trust. It wasn't, it was my Keevings, my damn house down payment. Gone. And now they had gifted it to my sister, as a wedding present. No mention of me, no thank you, just a photo, a hashtag, and a kick to the gut. I drove home in a blur. My husband, Nate, took one look at me and didn't even ask. He just handed me a glass of wine and said, "What did they do this time?" It wasn't the first time my parents had pulled some golden child crap with Megan, but this was a new level. This wasn't just favoritism. This was betrayal. I told him everything, about the Facebook post, the caption, the house being given to Megan like it was some kind of throwaway trinket. Nate listened, nodding slowly, jaw tightening the way it does when he's trying not to say what he really thinks. He'd always been polite about my parents, but he never liked the way they treated me. Hell, he'd witnessed it up close when we were still dating. The way my mom would interrupt me mid-sentence to gush over Megan's hair, or how my dad would completely forget my job title, even though I'd been at the same marketing firm for 10 years. But this wasn't just another Megan gets the last piece of pie situation. This was my sacrifice being turned into her fairy tale. I didn't sleep that night. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the day I wrote that check. It was a Thursday. I had taken an early lunch and sat in my car outside the bank, staring at the screen while the teller processed the cashier's check. I remember my hand shaking. That money had taken me 7 years to save. I was 36 at the time, single, and finally ready to look for a place of my own. And then my parents called. Their voices were tight with panic. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Dad had tried to refinance, but with his credit score in the gutter, it wasn't happening. They were crying, embarrassed, humiliated, and I loved them. I loved them enough to give up my dream, to tell them I had come into some money and that I'd be more comfortable knowing the house stayed in the family. They believed me, or maybe they didn't care enough to question it. Either way, they accepted the check. And now they had turned around and handed the house to Megan. Megan, who had just had a $35,000 wedding at a winery, who still called my dad to ask what mortgage meant when she saw it in a conversation. By morning, I had drafted 5 different versions of a text. One angry, one sarcastic, one just a photo of the check stub with no caption. I didn't send any of them. Instead, I waited. Waited to see if my parents would say something. Waited to see if maybe, just maybe, they'd pick up the phone and thank me, or explain, or lie. Anything would have been better than silence. 3 days later, I got a voicemail from my mom. Her voice was light, cheerful. "Hey, honey, hope you're doing well. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Your dad and I are thinking about moving out of the house in a few weeks. Megan's going to need the space, and well, Jeremy's allergic to cats, so they can't live in his place anymore. Anyway, we were wondering if we could stay in your guest house for a bit, just until we figure things out. Shouldn't be more than a month or 2. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, pulse pounding. The guest house, my guest house. The one I had poured my energy into fixing up. New floors, new roof, new AC. The one I'd had to sell last month when my work hours were cut and the bills started piling up. I had sold it quietly, hoping no one would ask questions. But now, they were asking to move in. And they had no idea It wasn't mine anymore. This was the moment. I could finally tell them. Tell them everything. Blow it up. Drop the truth like a bomb and walk away. But I didn't. I sat there mute, heart beating like a war drum, and stared out the window at the garden I'd planted last spring. I didn't know then what I was going to do. I didn't know that this would be the spark that lit a fire, big enough to make headlines. I just knew one thing, standing there with my mom's voice still echoing in my ear. Something had cracked, and it wasn't going to be fixed with a casserole and a fake apology this time. I sat on the couch with the remote in one hand and my mother's voicemail still playing in my head on repeat. Nate came home from the gym and saw the look on my face. He didn't even have to ask. I told him what she said, word for word, including the part where she asked if they could crash in the guest house, just until things settled down. I watched his expression shift from mild concern to something colder, almost incredulous, and he let out a slow, heavy sigh, like the weight of the last few years had just slammed back onto his chest. There was a long silence between us before he finally asked, "Do they know you sold it?" I shook my head. Of course they didn't. How could they? The last real conversation I'd had with them that wasn't surface-level small talk was 2 years ago, after I got promoted and they forgot to congratulate me. Megan had gotten a new car that week, a white BMW her fiancé had leased for her. And somehow, my parents decided that was the more pressing topic. Since then, it had been birthdays, holidays, the occasional just checking in call, and nothing deeper than weather and Megan's wedding planning drama. I thought about how ridiculous it was. Here I was, a 42-year-old woman with a solid job, a stable marriage, no kids by choice, and a carefully managed little life, and I still hadn't found the nerve to tell my own parents that I wasn't their damn safety net anymore. I didn't tell them about the guest house sale, even though it had been a gut-wrenching decision. It wasn't just a building, it was my backup plan, the thing that gave me breathing room. And now it was gone, sold to a retired couple who wanted a place near their grandkids. And I'd cried the night I signed the papers. But no, I didn't say a word to my parents, because part of me still believed they wouldn't care. I didn't respond to the voicemail. I let it sit. Days passed. More photos of Megan's honeymoon popped up on social media. Her feet in the sand, fruity drinks in hand, captions about manifesting joy. Every photo got dozens of comments from our extended family members, congratulating her, praising our parents for their generosity, and calling it the storybook beginning she deserved. No one asked where I was in any of those stories, and when Beth texted to ask if I'd be coming to Megan's housewarming barbecue, I almost threw my phone across the room. Instead, I finally responded to my mom's message. I kept it short. I told her the guest house had been sold. I said I was sorry, but it wasn't available anymore, and I hoped they had another plan. I pressed send, stared at the screen, and waited for the inevitable response. It didn't take long. The first message came from my sister, not my parents. Megan sent a screenshot of my reply to the family group chat, followed by 3 question marks and a laughing emoji, as if this whole thing was some inside joke I'd failed to get. Then came her message, sent just to me. "Wow, really classy. Guess we know where your loyalty lies. Hope the money was worth it." That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the slow, simmering realization that Megan actually believed she was owed that house. That the idea of my parents living with me wasn't a request, it was an expectation. And when I didn't deliver, I became the villain in her little narrative, the selfish one, the bitter older sister who couldn't be happy for her. I didn't respond to her message. I didn't even open the group chat again. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Nate, both of us staring at our phones in silence, I finally said what I had never dared to say out loud. I think they've always thought I was the fallback plan. Not the daughter, just the one who cleans up the mess. Nate reached over and turned off my phone. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Then maybe it's time you stopped cleaning." It should have felt empowering, but it didn't. It felt hollow, like I'd stepped outside of something I'd spent my whole life trying to maintain. The illusion that if I just worked hard enough, if I just stayed quiet and responsible and generous, they'd see me the way I wanted to be seen. As equal, as loved. The next day I got a call from my dad. I didn't answer. Then my mom tried. Still didn't answer. Finally, I got a long text from her, laced with faux concern and subtle guilt trips. She said they were confused and hurt by my tone, that they didn't know I had sold the guest house, and that they understood if I needed space, but family should be able to rely on each other. The irony nearly made me laugh. I started to type a reply, then stopped, because what was the point? They didn't want the truth. They wanted me to comply, to keep being the daughter who never caused a scene, who swallowed her disappointment with a smile and always had a room ready. And this time, I didn't have it in me. The silence stretched for almost a week. No new texts, no calls. Then suddenly, my phone lit up with a new notification. A public Facebook post from Megan. It was long, emotional, and vague enough to avoid names, but the message was clear to anyone who knew us. Sometimes the people who say they love you the most are the first to slam the door in your face. When our parents needed help, one of us stepped up, and one of us didn't. The comments poured in, supportive friends, well-meaning strangers, people asking who the villain was. A few even tagged my name, assuming I'd explain. I didn't. I logged out. But I knew one thing. This wasn't just a family fight anymore. It was becoming a story, and I had just lost control of the narrative. By the end of that week, it stopped feeling like a private family drama and started feeling like a smear campaign I never signed up for. What had started as a Facebook post from Megan, passive-aggressive, self-pitying, designed to guilt people into her corner, had morphed into a slow-burning wildfire across our entire family tree. Suddenly, I was getting texts from aunts I hadn't spoken to since Y2K, cousins who only ever messaged me for wedding RSVPs, and one very dramatic voicemail from Uncle Gary, who told me that, in times like this, you don't close your door to your parents, no matter what they've done. That last part, that little add-on, made me pause, no matter what they've done. Did he actually know what they'd done? Or had Megan just painted me as some callous, detached woman who sold off her guest house and left her sweet elderly parents out in the cold, like some kind of suburban villain? I wasn't surprised when Megan took it to social media. She had always had a knack for dramatizing her life, turning even minor inconveniences into episodes of a personal reality show, starring herself as the mistreated heroine. But what knocked the wind out of me was when one of my coworkers, Jen, from HR, knocked on my office door with a concerned look and asked if I was okay. That was when I learned Megan had made a TikTok. Not a throwaway one, not something private for friends, but a full, multi-part series about how her sister turned her back on their aging parents, complete with sad piano music, old family photos, and a cropped picture of our parents standing in front of the house I'd paid off. She didn't say my name, but the clues were obvious. She described her sister as a marketing exec in Portland, married, no kids, lives in a modern 2-story near the park. That might as well have been a bio ripped from my company directory. In one clip, she even hinted that I had inherited money and didn't want to share it, turning my sacrifice into some narrative where I was Scrooge McDuck, hoarding gold while our parents begged for crumbs. The comments made me nauseous. Strangers, actual strangers, telling her to cut that toxic sibling off. Or worse, offering to start a GoFundMe for our parents. I wasn't just angry, I was humiliated. I confronted her. I called her cell phone, and when she didn't answer, I sent a voice message because I wanted her to hear my tone, my exhaustion, my disbelief. I asked her why she would put something so personal online, and I told her flat out that what she was doing was cruel. She responded with a 10-word text that stopped me in my tracks. You should have just let them move in. It's that simple. Let me say something. It's never that simple. Not when it's your house, your peace, your life being offered up like some kind of consolation prize for people who never once offered you the same. It wasn't about space. It wasn't about comfort. It was about principle. My parents never asked. They assumed. They saw me as an extension of what they used to own, a piece of property they could transfer their needs onto. And Megan, she was just continuing the tradition, taking, expecting, rewriting history to make herself feel justified. A few days later, someone sent me a link to a local news blog. Not a major publication, but the kind of digital outlet that thrives off small-town drama with just enough reach to make things uncomfortable. The article was titled, "Family Rift Sparks Online Debate After Daughter Allegedly Turns Away Aging Parents." My name wasn't mentioned, but the details were all there. The house being gifted to the younger sibling, the parents looking for temporary housing, the older sister who had reportedly sold her guest house for profit during a time of family need. It read like a tabloid, complete with a stock photo of a couple holding moving boxes and a broken heart emoji in the headline. What made my skin crawl was the way the article ended, with a quote from a source close to the family saying that the parents were devastated by their daughter's coldness and unwillingness to communicate. I stared at that sentence for a long time, my jaw clenched, my fists curled, because I knew exactly who that source was, and there was only one person who would say something like that with the smugness to believe she was right, Megan. She was building a version of events where she came out looking like the martyr, and I came out looking like the ice queen. And the worst part? People were buying it. That night, Nate sat me down and told me that if this didn't stop soon, it was going to bleed into everything. My work, our social circle, even our marriage. Not because he didn't support me. He did. But because I was unraveling. I hadn't slept properly in a week. I'd stopped answering calls from my own friends, and I couldn't go 30 minutes without refreshing my phone to see if someone else had piled onto the drama. I was spiraling, and Megan was thriving. But just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I found out something that made everything else look like a schoolyard fight. Megan hadn't just told her side of the story. She had shared photos, private photos, screenshots of my messages. One of them, in particular, stood out. It was a cropped image of a check. The check I had written to the bank, the one with the routing number blurred out, but my name clearly visible in the top left corner. I had sent it to our parents years ago as proof the loan was paid. I'd emailed it, and someone, either my mom or my dad, had forwarded it to Megan, which meant the secret I had kept for 5 years wasn't a secret anymore. She knew. Megan knew. And instead of thanking me, instead of feeling guilty or ashamed or even remotely human, she used it as ammo. That was the night I stopped caring about keeping the peace. That was the night I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a war she wanted to win. And I was done playing defense, because now the world knew a piece of the truth. But they didn't know the whole damn story. Not yet. When I first saw my name at the top of that article, my mouth went dry. Not because it was printed in bold or splashed across some major newspaper, but because I had worked so hard to keep this entire mess from spilling into the public eye. For 5 years, I had carried the weight of that secret like a stone in my chest. Not for praise, not for recognition, but because I thought doing the right thing didn't need an audience. I thought helping my parents when they were drowning financially would buy me something I had been chasing my entire life. Their quiet respect. But here it was on full display, being spun into a spectacle by a journalist who barely scratched the surface. The article wasn't mean-spirited exactly, but it told the story like a fable. One daughter with a big heart, another with a bank account and a locked door. It danced around details, relied on emotion, and quoted a source close to the family more times than I could count. But what froze me in place was the paragraph near the end. The one that read, "According to documents shared with us by a family insider, the house in question was originally saved from foreclosure by a private, undisclosed payment believed to have come from the older daughter, Emily R., who never publicly claimed credit." I read it 3 times before I realized what had happened. Someone had leaked the check. The one I had sent to my parents, scanned and signed in my old apartment with trembling hands and a knot in my throat. I had told them it came from an inheritance, a distant cousin's forgotten estate, a convenient lie meant to protect their pride and my own fragile relationship with them. But they had kept it, and now Now it was public. Nate was the first to speak, because I couldn't. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, holding his phone like it was on fire, and asked the one question I hadn't even thought to ask. Who the hell gave them the check? I had to sit down. I was shaking too hard. At first I assumed it was Megan, fishing through old emails or maybe stealing it from my mom's inbox. But the tone of the article, the oddly sympathetic slant, the careful phrasing, felt strangely familiar. It wasn't until I remembered Brian, my ex, that everything clicked into place. Brian, the same man who had once promised me that he'd keep my confidence. The same man who knew about the house because I had vented to him one blurry night after too much wine, back when we were still stupidly circling the drain of our breakup. He worked in media now, not as a reporter, but in editorial strategy for that very blog. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but the timing, the language, the angle, it all stank of his fingerprints. So I called him. I shouldn't have. I know that now. But anger makes you reckless, and there's something about betrayal that sharpens your instincts into weapons. He answered like he didn't expect me to, his voice cheerful, maybe even a little smug. When I asked him if he leaked the check, he didn't deny it. He said he thought it was time the truth came out, that I deserved credit, that the world needed to see who I really was. I could have screamed. Instead, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. I asked him if he'd ever considered what that kind of exposure would cost me, what it would cost them, even if I no longer owed them loyalty. He said something I'll never forget. You weren't going to tell them, so I did it for you? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of our bed while Nate tried to coax me into coming to bed, reminding me gently that no one could undo what had been done. But I couldn't stop thinking about the look on my mother's face when she would read the article, when she would see her own daughter's name attached to something they had buried under silence. And then Megan would spin it into her own narrative like she always did. She would twist the truth into a weapon, accuse me of being manipulative, of orchestrating this whole thing for sympathy. And I was right, because the next morning I woke up to another storm. Megan had posted again. This time it was a response video, one of those long, rambling monologues where she barely contained her performative sadness, holding back tears while she thanked everyone for their support. She said, and I quote, "It's painful to learn that the person you trusted to be there for your family was actually keeping secrets. We didn't ask for a handout. We never wanted pity. But choosing to go public with something so personal, well, that says everything." She framed it like I had given the article, like I had used a check from years ago as a PR stunt to make myself look like a martyr. And of course, her fans, her followers, her circle of online sympathy ate it up like candy. People called me a narcissist, a liar, a woman obsessed with control. And all the while, the truth, the real truth, sat there, unbothered and unread by the very people who needed to hear it most. That afternoon, my father finally called. Not to ask if I was okay, not to apologize, but to tell me I had crossed a line. I asked him which line that was. The one where I saved their home, or the one where I stayed silent while they erased me. He didn't answer. He just said he wished I'd kept it between us. And then he hung up. I stared at my phone long after the screen went dark. And in that silence, something hardened in me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a family that had long since chosen their narrative over their daughter. I wasn't their savior. I wasn't their villain. I was just inconvenient. And now that the secret was out, the gloves were off. Because if they wanted a war of stories, I had one they hadn't heard yet. And it was going to get a hell of a lot louder than a check. I never intended to speak publicly. I didn't want to be part of the narrative that had already spun so far out of control, it barely resembled anything real. But when you've been painted as the cold-hearted daughter who left her aging parents out in the street, the silence becomes heavier than the truth. It wasn't just my name being whispered in online forums or around family tables anymore. It was being typed, reposted, dissected, and twisted into something grotesque by people who didn't even know how many bedrooms the house had, let alone what I gave up to keep it standing. So when the news station emailed me, I should have ignored it. It was a local affiliate. Nothing major, just one of those mid-market stations that fill their evening segments with neighborhood events and feel-good fluff pieces. But this time, they wanted me. The reporter, a woman named Tasha, said she'd been following the story after Megan's latest video crossed 100,000 views. She assured me she wanted to get both sides. That was the phrase she used, both sides. As if this was some kind of petty divorce, instead of the collapse of a 30-year foundation between a daughter and the parents who barely noticed her growing up. I waited a full day before responding. I asked Nate what he thought, hoping he'd talk me out of it, but instead he surprised me by saying, "If you don't speak, she'll keep writing your story for you." And that was exactly it. Megan had taken control of the narrative from day one. Every social post, every tear-streaked video, every falsely humble caption was another paragraph in a story that turned me into a villain. I couldn't take it anymore. I was done being quiet. We met the news crew at a neutral location, not our home, thank God. I wasn't about to let them into my kitchen to film me like some tabloid housewife explaining away a scandal. Instead, we picked a quiet room in a public library, one with soft lighting and clean backgrounds. Tasha showed up with a cameraman, a clipboard, and the kind of smile that looks warm until you notice how her eyes never stop scanning for the angle. She greeted me like an old friend, asked how I'd been holding up, and offered me a bottle of water before sliding into her chair across from mine. The first few questions were simple: background, timeline, the family dynamic growing up. I answered carefully, not because I had anything to hide, but because I knew how easily the truth could be clipped, edited, turned against me. I didn't want to say anything cruel, but it's hard to describe a lifetime of subtle rejection without sounding bitter. I told her about the loan, about how I paid it off, about the lie I told to protect their pride, and I could see in her face that she hadn't expected that part to be so quiet, so heavy, so devoid of drama. She kept waiting for me to break, to cry, to plead for sympathy, but I didn't give her that. I was calm, controlled, angry, yes, but the kind of anger that simmers under the surface, where it gets sharp and precise instead of loud. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you regret selling the guest house?" It wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't neutral either. It was loaded, shaped like curiosity, but meant to press a bruise. I paused. I thought about the months leading up to that decision, the stress, the tension, the feeling of my life closing in around me while everyone assumed I was fine. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, I regret giving so much of myself to people who never saw it." The interview wrapped, and she thanked me politely, told me the piece would air that weekend, and promised to keep the tone balanced. But I knew better. Nothing about this was going to be balanced. Megan had already poisoned the well, and all I could do now was hope that some small sliver of the truth made it through the edit. The piece aired on Saturday night, just after the local sports segment. It was slick, well-paced, dramatic in that way local news always tries to be. They used photos, some I recognized from Megan's Instagram, others that must have come from old family albums. They clipped my quotes carefully, cutting just before the parts where I made the most sense, letting my pauses hang in the air a little too long. The check was shown again, briefly, blurred but still unmistakably mine. And the closing line? That one hit like a brick to the chest. While some say it's a story of family betrayal, others see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets and silence. I stared at the screen, numb, as Nate sat beside me, his jaw clenched. The phone rang not 5 minutes later. It was my mother. This time I answered. Her voice was flat, clipped, not angry, but worse, disappointed. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't mention the loan. All she said was, "I didn't think you'd go public like that." I reminded her that I didn't, that someone else had shared the check, that Megan had turned our lives into a circus before I ever opened my mouth. My mother was quiet for a moment, then said something I hadn't expected. "You made us look like bad parents." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her where that concern was when Megan was dragging my name across the internet, when she was weaponizing our private history for clout. I wanted to ask her why she never once stood up for me, even privately, but all I said was, I didn't have to make you look like anything. You did that all by yourselves. And then I hung up. The fallout came quickly, more emails, more messages, more articles. One blog accused me of financial manipulation, which was laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Another speculated that I had pressured my parents into signing over assets. Pure fiction, but it didn't stop people from commenting. The worst part wasn't the strangers. It was the people I knew. Friends from college, old co-workers, even some distant relatives, who started to check in, the way people do when they want to hear the gossip straight from the source. But it was the envelope that arrived 2 days later that really changed everything. A thick manila folder, hand-delivered to my house by a courier. No return address, just my full name on the label. Inside were legal documents, and at the very top, in clean professional font, were the words, Notice of Civil Intent to Pursue Financial Claim. Megan was suing me, and she wasn't doing it quietly. The first time I flipped through the paperwork, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was disbelief. Thick, pressing disbelief that my own sister had taken the circus and somehow elevated it into a full-scale legal assault. The folder was stuffed with documents, some printed from screenshots of texts, others actual legal drafts bearing her lawyer's signature, outlining the supposed financial misconduct I had committed by deliberately interfering with the transfer of familial property for personal gain. I had to read that line 4 times to understand what she was claiming. In short, Megan was suing me under the claim that I had used undisclosed financial leverage, meaning the mortgage payoff, to manipulate our parents into eventually transferring the house to her without full transparency, which, in her lawyer's words, constitutes a violation of ethical family fiduciary obligations. I sat at the dining table with the documents spread out like a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal. Nate stood behind me, silent at first, then said something in a voice so steady it didn't even sound like him. She's trying to rewrite history into a lawsuit. I couldn't respond. It was too ridiculous, too low even for Megan, who had long since stopped recognizing lines when she crossed them. The idea that I had somehow plotted this, that my financial help was a manipulation rather than a sacrifice, was so backwards it bordered on parody. But the papers were real, and the intent was clear. She wasn't just out for revenge anymore. She wanted money, validation, and probably the last word. We called a lawyer that evening, someone recommended by a friend who had gone through an ugly inheritance dispute. Her name was Dana, sharp as glass and twice as cold, and from the first 10 minutes of our meeting, I knew she wasn't interested in the sentimental side of the story. She wanted facts, timelines, proof. I gave her everything. The email where I sent the scanned check. The original letter from the bank acknowledging the mortgage payoff. The emails from my parents thanking me, not directly, but in the cryptic, guilty way they always communicated when it came to money. I even gave her access to the digital receipts for the Guesthouse renovations, just in case Megan tried to say I'd mishandled something else. Dana listened, nodding occasionally, her pen tapping the legal pad with mechanical rhythm. Then, almost casually, she asked to see the deed transfer, the one Megan claimed showed her full ownership of the house. I hadn't seen it. All I had were the photos, the party, the social media posts, and my mother's voicemail saying they were moving out. But I hadn't seen any formal proof. Megan never showed it. My parents never mentioned it. So Dana ran a search through the county records database, typing quickly, pausing, then typing again. After a few minutes, she leaned back in her chair and tilted her head slightly, like she had just uncovered a hidden passage in a storybook. Well, this is interesting, she said. According to the county, the house was never formally transferred. There's a signed quitclaim deed on file from your parents to Megan, but it was never recorded, which means it's not legally binding. I blinked. Wait, so you're telling me the house isn't even hers? Dana smiled thinly. Legally speaking, no, not yet. The transfer exists in spirit, but not on paper. And if your parents accepted that payoff as part of an unspoken agreement that the house would remain in the family or in their name, well, there's a case to be made that you have a legal interest, especially since you never relinquished any stake. It took me a second to understand what she meant. My stomach flipped as I realized what she was implying. I could fight this, not just defend myself, but counterclaim. I could argue that the house still belonged to my parents, and if they defaulted without my money, it would have been lost anyway. In some twisted way, that meant I might still have the legal grounds to reclaim it. I stood up, walked over to the window, and stared out at the yard, unsure what to feel. For years, I'd convinced myself that I didn't care about the house. It was just a place. 4 walls, a roof, and 1,000 memories, most of them bittersweet. But standing there, knowing Megan had stood on those steps, accepted those keys, smiled for the camera while the whole world called her blessed, I realized I did care. Not because I wanted to live there, but because it wasn't hers to take, and certainly not hers to weaponize against me. The next day, Dana sent a formal letter to Megan's attorney requesting clarification on the unrecorded deed and notifying them of our intent to pursue a cross-claim if the suit moved forward. She was professional, surgical, and completely unmoved by the inevitable drama it would provoke. I, on the other hand, spent the rest of the day fielding text messages from relatives who suddenly remembered my number, each one trying to get a clearer picture of what's really going on. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't post a statement or record a video or reach out to Megan. I sat in the silence, letting the weight of it all settle. For the first time since this started, I had leverage, real, legal, undeniable leverage. And the question that burned at the back of my throat wasn't whether I would use it, but whether I should. Because this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about what happens when you finally hold the power after a lifetime of being the afterthought. When you can, with one signature, change the course of the story entirely. I told Dana I needed a few days to think. Then, without ceremony, I picked up the phone and called a real estate agent. The first thing I said to her wasn't hello, it was, I'm thinking of listing a property. There was a stillness in my house during those few days after contacting the real estate agent. The kind of unnerving quiet that doesn't soothe you, but instead amplifies the hum of every old appliance and the creak of every wooden floorboard. Like the walls themselves were listening to my thoughts and waiting for me to either stand firm or completely unravel. I had asked for time to think. But what I was really doing was weighing every inch of my history against the weight of what it would mean to finally act like I mattered. To step out from the background of this family dynamic, where I had always been the helper, the fixer, the quiet one who carried other people's burdens. Like that was my life's purpose. For the first time, I was being handed a chance not to simply speak up, but to make a move that couldn't be ignored or spun into someone else's version of events. The idea of reclaiming the house was no longer just legal strategy. It had begun to feel symbolic, like taking it back meant rewriting something bigger than property rights, something about my entire place in the family. But that symbolism was heavy, and I wasn't naive enough to think it would come without cost. If I pursued it, I wouldn't just be calling Megan's bluff. I'd be making a public declaration that the version of events my parents and my sister had clung to for years was a lie. And in doing so, I would be burning whatever remained of the fragile, cracked bridge between us. There would be no reconciliation, no neat resolution, just scorched earth. The real estate agent, a calm woman named Renee, with a voice like a teacher who'd seen everything twice, met me at a coffee shop and laid everything out plainly. The market was strong, especially in that neighborhood, and if I moved quickly, I could list the house in a matter of weeks. She assured me the legal loophole was unusual, but not unprecedented, especially given the incomplete transfer of ownership and my financial records. She told me that if I wanted to proceed, she could have a photographer and a staging crew in the house within days. She even slid a folder across the table that contained sample listings for similar homes in the area, each one neatly itemized with estimates and timelines, as if this were any other transaction and not the emotional detonation of my entire upbringing. I took the folder home, set it on the dining table, and stared at it for hours. I didn't touch it. I didn't open it. Instead, I poured a glass of wine and walked through my house like I was floating in someone else's life. I thought about the first time I learned how to drive in the empty lot behind the old grocery store with my dad, gripping the passenger door like he was afraid it would fly off. I thought about the way my mother used to hum to herself while folding laundry, not realizing I was listening from the hallway, because that was the only time she sounded peaceful. I thought about the times Megan had run to me crying, heartbroken, or angry, and I'd held her like a mother might, even though she was the one they always chose first. I thought about all of it, and I wondered what it said about me that I still wanted to protect parts of those memories, even when the people who created them had long since stopped protecting me. Nate came home from work and found me sitting in the living room with the listing folder still untouched beside me. He didn't ask me if I was going to sell it. He didn't pressure me. Instead, he just sat down across from me and said, "What do you want, Emily? Not what's fair, not what's strategic. What do you want?" And I realized I didn't know. I had spent so long reacting to other people's decisions that I had forgotten how to recognize my own desires when they showed up. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened a blank document on my laptop. I started typing, not a legal response, not a statement for the press, not a letter to my parents or Megan, but a trust document. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had done enough research by then to know what I wanted. I called Dana, told her what I was thinking, and for the first time since we'd met, she paused for more than a second before responding. She didn't say it was wise. She didn't say it was foolish. She simply said, "That's a move I didn't expect." 2 weeks later, the paperwork was filed. The house would not go to Megan. It wouldn't go back to my parents. It would be placed in a legally binding trust, assigned to Megan's unborn daughter, who was still a mystery to the world, a future human with no idea what kind of battleground she was being born into. The terms were simple. No one could sell, transfer, or inhabit the home in the meantime. It would remain empty, maintained through the trust's funds, until her 21st birthday, at which point it would be hers, no strings attached. I didn't tell Megan directly. I let her lawyer deliver the news. Predictably, the response was swift and furious. She called it insane, accused me of stealing from her child while pretending to be generous, and posted another one of her signature teary videos, this time framing herself as a mother, fighting for her baby's future against a vindictive, controlling relative. The comments poured in like clockwork, split between strangers who believed her and others who had followed closely enough to see the cracks. My parents didn't respond. I imagine they didn't know how. Or maybe they were simply too tired to continue pretending that their silence hadn't been a choice all along. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still, like I had finally stepped off a treadmill I didn't realize I'd been running on my whole life. The house would sit quiet now, not claimed, not gifted, not weaponized. It would wait, untouched, until the girl born into this mess grew up and maybe, just maybe, walked through that front door with fresh eyes and no idea how many versions of the truth had once fought for possession of its walls. Sometimes, people ask me why I didn't just keep the house, why I didn't sell it or move into it or rent it out to squeeze every ounce of value from the pain it represented. I never have a satisfying answer. All I can say is that it didn't feel like mine anymore, not because it never was, but because owning it would have meant living inside a history I had finally learned to walk away from. I still pass by the neighborhood sometimes. I don't stop. I don't slow down. But I look at the house and wonder if one day that little girl will knock on my door, curious about the name on the trust papers, and ask why I did what I did. And if she does, I'll tell her the truth. Or maybe I won't. Maybe the truth isn't the point. Maybe the point is that, for once, the story didn't end the way anyone expected it to. They think I lost, but I just stopped playing their game.